Hello, welcome to Unit 2, Part 2. In Unit 2, if you will recall, we will be studying the biological basis of behavior. In this presentation, we discuss the central nervous system. The central nervous system is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain and the spinal cord are the main connecting points for our entire body. First, I want to discuss the general areas of the brain. There are four general areas of the brain: the frontal lobes, the parietal lobes, the occipital lobes, and the temporal lobes. The term is plural, as there are a left and right of each lobe. The frontal lobe. Some scientists believe delayed frontal lobe development explains why some adolescents show poor impulse control and engage in risky behaviors. During this period of rapid development, the brain's amygdala section, the area responsible for gut reaction and heightened arousal, might become overactive. At the same time these changes occur, myelin, the tissue surrounding the nerves, begins growing in the frontal brain. If development in this part of the brain fails to occur, it might lead to attention deficit disorder or other psychological problems. One study linked poor frontal lobe development to antisocial personality disorder. A deficit in brain growth might also hinder concentration and decision-making skills. Researchers have found that illicit drug use, premature birth, and brain injury also affect how this region of the brain develops. The parietal lobe and the functions of this parietal lobe range from perception of visual and touch stimuli to preparing a plan of action to respond to these stimuli. Disruption of the functions of the parietal lobe can also result in language, movement, and writing problems. Neuroscientists sometimes split the parietal lobe into the dominant and the non-dominant parietal lobes. The non-dominant section is mostly involved in registering the visual and spatial information that a person needs to move smoothly through space and to know where his or her body parts are at any one time. This area constructs the perception of the world that we need to move through it. Other forms of stimuli that the lobe registers are touch, pain, and temperature. The dominant section takes these sensory stimuli and collates them together as instructions to the body on how to move in response to the stimuli. Then the signals move to the frontal lobe, which tells the relevant body parts to move. If the right-hand side of the parietal lobe is damaged, an affected person may have trouble perceiving parts of his or her body and could also have trouble constructing objects because he or she is unable to put all the visual and spatial stimuli together accurately. The occipital lobe. The primary functions of the occipital lobe include certain aspects of visual processing. Information received by the eyes is sent on to the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe, which is further processed by two levels of the visual association cortex. Damage to the primary visual cortex may result in blindness, while damage to the visual association cortex may cause visual agnosia. Visual agnosia is a medical condition in which the affected person can see an object before him or her, but cannot understand what the object is or what the object is used for. In other words, the person lacks object recognition. People affected with this condition do not have any structural or neurological damage to the eye, nor is there any erosion in their intelligence that would account for the failure of object recognition. The temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is an area of the cerebral cortex, a sheet of layered neural tissue on the brain. There is one temporal lobe on the lower middle of the outside of each of the brain's two hemispheres. These lobes are responsible for auditory perception, and they play a role in speech, vision, and long-term memory. Imp- Impaired temporal lobe function can lead to many difficulties for the patient. The temporal lobes process the majority of sensory input. It is this area of the brain that helps a person learn to place pictures or words into different categories. Lesions occurring on the temporal lobes can inhibit this activity. The temporal lobes also are responsible for a person's fight or flight responses. The brain. In this next group of slides, we will briefly overview the different areas of the brain and their functions. We will start with the cerebral cortex, or cerebrum. The cerebrum has higher mental functions such as thinking, language, learning, memory, emotions, and voluntary movement. The functions of the cerebral cortex are to receive sensory input, interpret the senses, and coordinate motor control. The cerebral cortex is made of gray matter and covers the cerebrum and cerebellum. The different lobes of the cerebral cortex subdivide processing responsibilities based on sensory input or motor function. Brain damage can impair the functions of the cerebral cortex, reducing an individual's cognitive or thinking capability. The corpus callosum is a bundle of nerve fibers that allow communication between the right and the left brain. Although this area is largely composed of uniform material, the back or posterior portion is named the splenium, while the front anterior portion is called the genu. In 1982, an article was published that claimed the corpus callosum is larger in women than in men, permitting greater crosstalk between the two hemispheres, but this was subsequently found to be false. The thalamus. The thalamus is a relay station that integrates sensory input and regulates the sleep-wake or circadian cycles. The thalamus is best known as the final relay station for perceptual data before it is passed on to the cerebral cortex. It receives input from diverse brain areas, primarily including all the senses except the sense of smell or olfaction. It is also responsible for regulating motor control. Because the thalamus is the nucleus of so much relaying activity, it has long been regarded as the Rosetta Stone of the nervous system, giving a lot of insight into the importance and direction of various neural signals. The thalamus modulates arousal mechanisms, maintains alertness, and directs attention to sensory events. The pons. The pons conveys sensory information from the spinal cord to the forebrain. It also regulates the sleep cycle. The three primary functions of the pons are acting as a pathway for signals traveling between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, helping transmit cranial nerve signals out of the brain and into the face and ears, and controlling certain involuntary functions like respiration and consciousness. Though the pons is a small part of the brain, it is a very important one. It is located in the brain stem, and it makes it ideally suited to conduct signals in and out. And it serves as the point of origin for many important cranial nerves. Anytime people chew, swallow, breathe, and sleep, they are, in most cases, using the pons. The pons also plays a role in hearing. The cerebellum. The cerebellum regulates coordination and balance. The primary function of the cerebellum is to provide feedback and fine-tuning for motor output. It is also associated with the sense of proprioception, which involves us with an intuitive map of the location of our body parts. Without proprioception, it would be impossible to remain balanced while walking in the dark. We wouldn't have an intuitive sense of where our legs were located. Like many other parts of the brain, the cerebellum was originally associated with a single function, but with the advent of positron emission tomography, or PET scans, and other neural imaging techniques, it has been discovered that it is activated in tasks requiring the delegation of attention and the processing of language, music, and other sensory temporal stimuli. The hypothalamus. This regulates body temperature, reproduction, emotional states, aggression, and stress response. The hypothalamus controls the nervous system by synthesizing and releasing neurohormones at regular intervals. Different neurohormones represent distinct signals to the rest of the nervous system. The hypothalamus serves as an interface between the limbic system, endocrine system, and the autonomous nervous system. One well-known hormone released by this region is oxytocin, known to play a role in both romantic love and female lactation. The pituitary gland. This gland sits back in the back of the brain, directly behind the nose and between optic nerves. This pea-sized gland rests in a small pocket of bone called the pituitary fossa and dangles from a thin thread connected to the hypothalamus, a minute part of the brain responsible for controlling numerous bodily functions. The location of the pituitary gland fiber acts as a pathway for nerves and blood vessels that carry messages from the brain to release hormones throughout the body. Hormones that regulate the thyroid are secreted via the front part of the pituitary gland. These substances control metabolism and growth and affect many organs of the body. This area also regulates the production of cortisol in the adrenal glands. Cortisol tells the body to metabolize fats, proteins, carbohydrates, and it also controls blood pressure. The medulla regulates the functions such as heartbeat and respiration. The medulla oblongata is a structure found in the brains of vertebrate animals, including humans. This structure controls a number of autonomic functions, including respiration and blood pressure. This makes it a very critical part of the brain. Damage to the medulla oblongata can be fatal, as the patient will be unable to breathe, swallow, or perform other basic motor functions without assistance. This structure is also believed to be the key to how general anesthesia works, as the anesthetics depress the medulla oblongata so that it cannot function as it normally would. The brainstem. The brainstem connects the spinal cord to higher regions of the brain. It also has the reticular activating system that regulates the sleep and waking cycles. The RAS also controls alertness, information filtering, and arousal states. Arguably, it is the most primitive part of the brain, but also among the most essential. The brainstem primarily regulates autonomic functions along with the parts of the central nervous system outside the brain. These functions include cardiovascular, heartbeat and blood pressure, pain sensitivity, control alertness, respiratory control, and most broadly, consciousness. Though this word is notably slippery to define, if this region is damaged, death is probable, whereas if parts of the cortex or outer layer is damaged, survival is much more likely. The midbrain. This part connects the lower part of the brain, or hindbrain, with the higher functions. Functions of the midbrain are achieved through the cerebral cortex, cerebellum, and substantia nigra. Input is collected from the environment and sent to the cerebral cortex. The substantia nigra uses input sent from the cerebral cortex to regulate voluntary movements and moods. A path called the rubrospinal tract runs from the cerebellum to the bottom motor centers of the brain and sends input as a route for voluntary movement signals. Ventricles. While the brain is made up of largely dense collections of nerve tissue, and the brain's ventricular system is connected to the central canal of the spinal cord. This helps circulate necessary cerebrospinal fluid throughout the brain. This fluid serves to protect the brain and allows the brain to float within the skull, thus reducing its relative weight. The lateral ventricles are located within the brain, with one ventricle located in each hemisphere. They are roughly horseshoe-shaped, with a central region as well as anterior or frontal posterior or rear and inferior or temporal horns. This curved shape causes the lateral ventricles to pass through all four lobes of the brain: frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital. Finally, the spinal cord. This is the highway for neurological information, which exists in different forms. This information is transmitted by way of nerves, which also exist in different forms. Sensory nerves, for example, are those that provide information that needs to be sent to the brain. Motor nerves carry messages in the opposite direction from the brain to various parts of the body, often providing commands as to how they should function. The spinal column. There are many problems that can occur if the spinal cord is damaged. Since different regions are responsible for different parts of the body, the effects are determined by the area where the injury occurs. For example, injury to the lumbar region can result in complete loss or decreased control over the legs. The spinal cord and the nervous system are related in the sense that the spinal cord, along with the brain, is a component of the central nervous system. In the central nervous system, information picked up by the system of nerves and receptors throughout the body, known as the peripheral nervous system, is interpreted. The central nervous system also sends signals out to the peripheral nervous system in response to this information. As a major component of the central nervous system, the spinal cord delivers signals from the peripheral nervous system to the brain, as well as transmits impulses from the brain to the peripheral nervous system. For instance, impulses that tell the leg to take a step or the hands to snatch back from a hot surface. Please do request these references if you wish to use them. I can email them to you. Be sure to specify Unit 2, Part 2 when you make your request. Thank you for watching this